Reading today comes from Luke chapter 17, verses 5 to 10. The apostle said to the Lord, "Increase your faith." The Lord replied, "If you had faith in the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you. Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from plowing and tending sheep in the field, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to them, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron, and serve me while I eat and drink? Later you may eat and drink'? Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done.' Your word, O Lord, is lamp to our feet and a light to our path."
Anybody like the analogy or the simile of being compared to a worthless slave? How's that working for you? All right. I'm not going to start there today. It's really easy to see big acts of faith. It's really easy to see the heroics, the courage, the moments when others do amazing things in the name of God. Really easy to see faith in those kind of big moments. And as a congregation, there have been big moments, big acts of faith, historically and in the present right now. There are big acts of faith that go on for us as a church. The fact we've got living English classes, the op shop, men's shed, the community garden, ends meet, all of those activities and more started with mustard seed acts of faith and became mulberry trees in the ocean. And they're really easy to spot. They're really easy to see. We're about to embark on another one. We're about to embark on what I think is another big and faithful action, in that we're starting on the journey of building relationships with our local Aboriginal community. And you'll have read in News and Notes that David Harmon's going to lead us as we get started on this, in terms of our prophetic voice and what we want to say about the upcoming referendum. Now, I know that I grew up in a time when telling jokes about Aboriginals was kind of pretty normal. I grew up in a time when I would say there wasn't a lot of respect. But in my time, the tide has turned, thankfully. There'll be others of you in the room who are older than I, who have got it probably a bit more cemented on, that the problem doesn't sit with us, but it sits with Aboriginal people and their inability to move on or forget or whatever. And I don't know where you're at. I don't want to make assumptions about where everybody in the room is at. I like to think that as an inclusive congregation, that we have a starting point that's about compassion and graciousness and recognition and reconciliation. I was moved this week, it was funny, I was just caught glimpses of some words that helped me to express what it is I'm hoping for in the upcoming, what the upcoming referendum, but also all the movements of recognition and reconciliation and respect, what all those kind of movements in our nation, what I'm hoping they're going to bring. And it comes from Professor Graceland Smallwood. She's OAM, and she's a Bindal Birrabit Birraguba, Kalkaudun and South Islander woman. And she said, she's quoted as saying this: "Being involved in the endless struggle has taught me to grow spiritually without bitterness." Being involved in the endless struggle has taught me to grow spiritually without bitterness. And if I can find anything at all about which might express what I'm hoping for my kids, well, not for my kids, but for the children of Aboriginal, for the next generation, for this generation, the next generation, the one after and the one after, is that we won't be living in an environment where bitterness is even an issue. That we as a nation will mature enough to be able to understand the pain that's been inflicted, and rather than hide from it or turn from it or point the blame somewhere else, acknowledge it. And my hope is that as a nation we will find a way to listen to our Aboriginal brothers and sisters and work with them in relationship towards reconciliation. Not as we prescribe it, but as they desire it. So that's the movement I'm hoping for, to eliminate bitterness. And I don't know, as a congregation, we may be entering into it from a different place than that. I'm just expressing my hope, my vision. And I guess I'm saying to us, that's a big act of faith. I see that as a big act of faith. There'll be, some of you will have been through far more personal and smaller big acts of faith. I'm sure your story, your faith journey, has moments where you have lent into God, fallen into God, for strength, for courage, for purpose, for sustenance to make it through tough times, for help in making big decisions, for trying to make sense of what's going on around you. And there'll be moments in your life where you've taken a mustard seed and turned it into a mulberry tree in the ocean. In other words, where a little bit of faith has helped you to get through. It might have been about around relationships or around work or about moving cities, or it might be about use of money and generosity. It might be something missional that you've been involved in, or something in ministry, a decision you've made. It might be a decision not to do something. It might be a decision where you've had to address something within you that causes pain that you know you're the only person that can sort it out. And leaning into God's been a big mustard seed moment. Today's passage isn't so much about the big mustard seed. Sorry, the small mustard seed turned into the big act. Today's passage is far more mundane. Today's passage is far less about the heroics and the courageous and the giant leaps. In today's passage, we're invited to stop and turn on ourselves and think about the small things. That's what today's passage is about. It's about the everyday, the unseen sometimes, acts of faith. Today's passage invites us to shift from seeing ourselves as being inactive or passive recipients God, I need more faith. God, I need more trust. God, I want more. Today's passage tries to put a crowbar under us and lever us out of that position. Today's passage helps us to shift a little bit from faith being just an intellectual exercise. The intellectual, reasoning, knowing, cerebral part of faith is called trust. But trust on its own is not faith. Trust is the part that recognises that something can be done, something could happen, that I know from previous experience that God will hold me through this. Faith is doing it. Trust is the knowing, faith is the living. Faith is the movement, the action that comes from the trust that you hold. In our passage today, and sometimes in passages, you'd know how I preach. You've had enough of me already. Sometimes I like to lean into the Greek, to go back to the original language and see what it might really be trying to say to us. Sometimes I'm trying to do things through the context of the situation or the circumstances or what's come before or what's coming after. Today, I just want to, like all week, I just can't get, it's been sitting with me that this passage is addressed. Luke is right when the author of Luke is writing. It says that the audience is the apostles. The word apostle is only used once in the book of Matthew and the book of Mark, and not used at all in the book of John. But in Luke it turns up about 7 or 8 times. And Luke had this thing of letting his audience know that there were times when Jesus was just talking to the inner 12. So in some ways we're getting to be part of an inner conversation here. And what's going on is that the apostles, in the book of Luke, previous to this, just directly previous, Jesus has said to them, it's the passage about, a little line about having to be prepared to give 70 times 7. In other words, an uncountable number of times. There's also a little warning about not causing others to stumble. And obviously it's hit them because they stand there and go, well, man, I need more faith. If I'm going to be, just on those 2 things alone, if I'm going to be not a stumbling block, but if I'm going to be a hopeful presence, and if I'm going to have to learn how to forgive over and over and over and over again, then I'm going to need more faith. And they turn to Jesus and they say, give us more faith. I need more faith than what I've got right now if I'm going to live that kind of way. The Jesus response, there are times when Jesus kind of, as I say, every time I think I've got Jesus nailed down and gentle, like Jesus seemed a little frustrated in his response. And I can't sort that out. But I think part of his, if it is frustration that I'm hearing in his voice, it's because these are the same apostles who have been there and conducted themselves miracles. They've confronted spiritual powers. They've fed the hungry. And here they are now asking for more faith. And Jesus' response, if I can paraphrase it as best I can, I think Jesus is saying, you know what? You've already got it. You've already got it. He's trying to say to them, rather than being, I can't give you more faith. It's interesting that, isn't it? That when we seek more faith, Jesus is saying, don't look at me. Isn't that a strange thing? Jesus says, don't look at me and say, I want more faith. His little story about the slave, and I know it's problematic about the slave coming in. And what I think he's trying to say here is this, is that faith, if you want to grow more faith, get on and do the little things. The little things that you do that don't have fanfare, there's no parade, there's no ticker tape, there's no one going, well done, there's no certificate of participation. Jesus is saying, just get on and do it. If you want to grow faith, get on and live it. Turn it from the cerebral, knowing, trusting exercise into faith and do it every day. Get up and do it and live it. That's where you'll find faith. It seems a bit strange, doesn't it? Because the deeply spiritual part of me wants to say, if I want to have more faith, then I've got to look at Jesus. I go to Jesus, I can ask Jesus for faith. But what Jesus is saying here is the deeply spiritual thing is to find faith by living it. And that requires you to be in relationship with others. So my friends, what I'm hearing today in our passage of Scripture, and it's my encouragement to you today, is that if you want to find faith, if you want a deeper faith, if you want a wider faith, if you want a longer faith, if you want a more courageous faith, if you want a fuller faith, then each and every time you encounter the opportunity to be more compassionate or more kind or more generous or more grateful, more hospitable. Every time you encounter the opportunity to turn and stop doing things in your own strength and say to God, thank you. Or to praise God and to recognise, even just to take that, what is now a countercultural step in our society, to say, God. Not, oh my God, as it comes off most people's lips, but to turn and say, God. Recognising that there's something bigger than us that draws us to life. Someone bigger than us who draws us to life. Every time you choose to be a little more inclusive when you get the opportunity, to be a little more gracious, to seek the peaceful path. Every time you have the opportunity to be forgiving. Every time you have the opportunity to be a hopeful presence, then, my friends, you have the opportunity to grow faith. Many of you, I'm sure David Goss, if I didn't mention this quote, was going to catch me on the way out with this one, if not another one, because David's good. I love Dave. David catches me with David Goss always has a line for me that I wish I had before I started the sermon often. But today I want to leave you with a line from G.K. Chesterton, an English writer and a lay theologian. And many of you will already be familiar with this. You know what I'm going to say, David? No. All right. This is what G.K. Chesterton says. He says, the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and untried. I'll say that for you again. The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and untried. Do you understand what that's saying? Sorry if I'm mansplaining or minister-splaining for you. But for those of you who might not have caught it, what he's trying to say is, it's not that the Christian faith doesn't work, it's that we don't try it. We find it too difficult. And it is difficult. It's hard sometimes to choose compassion or kindness or patience or forgiveness or generosity. It's hard sometimes to be forgiving. Very hard. It's hard to be hopeful. But friends, if I'm learning anything from Jesus today, it's that boot in the backside that simply says, try it, do it, live it. Because that's where you will find faith. That's where you will find more faith. And that's where you'll find life. Amen. We're going to sing.